Thank you all for coming. I'm seeing a lot of new faces out there, so I hope that you, along with me, will learn a lot tonight about ranked choice voting. I am Carol Leshy, and on behalf of the League of Women Voters, I'd like to welcome you. For over 100 years, the League has educated voters and defended our democracy. We are a grassroots, nonpartisan organization that does not support or endorse any candidates. However, we do support issues, and we do support different positions. But in order to arrive at our support is based on study and consensus and voting by the local, state, or national league. So, along with that, I'm going to introduce you to Rob Richie is one of the nation's leading authorities on ranked choice voting, Fair Vote co-founder and former CEO. Today, Rob leads Expand Democracy, while acting as a senior advisor to Favorite and several other electoral reform organizations. I'm going to turn it over to Rob, and I'm sure he'll be happy to take questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you all for coming on a beautiful day. I'm visiting Ben. How's the sound? We just didn't really get a chance to test it, but okay, great. If you ever seem to lose sound, let me know, because I won't necessarily know. So anyway, I'm visiting Ben. My sister lives here, Rob Richie. She's an author. Check out her new book that will be released in September called Seven Forests. She's terrific. Her last book, Halcyon Journey, won a big national award. Anyway, it's always beautiful to be here. I just was hiking to Moon Falls. Wow. Okay, so you live in Paradise. So you also are a state that's having conversations about ranked choice voting. It's been on the ballot. It's been used in some local party organizations and other things. It's becoming a national issue. There's a proposed ballot measure for proportional ranked choice voting in the county. And so I'm not here to speak on these issues from like a local perspective. You should hear from locals about the case for and against these things. But I am coming as a general long-term advocate for this, and I'll just sort of give a little background to me. I actually got involved in these issues 36 years ago in Thurston County, Washington, up in Olympia, where there was a charter commission effort, and I got involved working for proportional representation. That seemed exciting to me, and I was looking around trying to find the people who worked on this. I found people who were interested, but there was no organization. I went to Cincinnati to actually help a campaign for proportional RCV, and in Cincinnati founded Fair Vote with others in '92, and then led that organization for 31 years till 2023. And we did pretty well. We built a $7 million organization. I'm writing a lot of books, we've been a lot of media. For other reforms, by the way, maybe in Q&A if people are interested or afterwards, National Popular Vote Interstate Compact is something I've had a big role in advancing. Automatic voter registration, ranked choice voting wins in a lot of states and cities, and the Fair Representation Act in Congress, which we'll talk a little bit more. Today I run Expand Democracy and do advise several organizations in a pathway through hiking the Pacific Crest Trail, which is beautiful. Oregon next year. Here's the context that I think probably this is a well-educated room, but really we are at a time of democracy at risk, not just here in the United States, but it's a international phenomenon. There's a lot of big things that have changed that I think make old practices needing to change as well, and sometimes they don't change in tandem, but how we communicate, how we associate, how we participate, all these things are really kind of undercutting democracy in a big way around the world. And there's a lot of positive responses, but it's a contested moment. With Expand Democracy, our goal is to cast a wide net, look for good reform ideas, and try to accelerate the ones that maybe could be moved faster. Ranked choice voting has always been, for me, a powerful element of change. And I think, as I'll try to get in today, I think it's fundamentally a tool for voting rights. It's how to make your vote count more, and that's, in some ways, makes your vote count more than almost any other thing, and I'll get into some of that too. So today we're going to review ranked choice voting, value and uses, its challenges, and then we'll talk some about the proportional rank choice system as it's being proposed here in Deschutes County, again from a national perspective. So we just celebrated 250 years, which is exciting, and I just wanted to lift up these words from the Declaration. Right, they're familiar, but they're good to kind of think back on about where we started, we the people. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and women, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. That to secure these rights, this is where the democracy comes in. Governments are instituted among men and women, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So that has to be democracy to make that work. And we have to continually look at it and boldly and potentially abolish it, but generally alter it. And we've done a lot of alterations. And it's never been static. It can't be static. We have to keep growing with the times. And that's really from the beginning. I think it's such an important part of the government outlined for the people. So in that spirit, I was just hoping I can get a few people to boldly shout out in ways that I can write down. So I'm going to try to maybe jump out of the slideshow for a second and get into where I can actually write down what identities and interests do you think should reflect voters when we're measuring the consent of the government? What are just some parts of you, or do you just think generally, should be represented when a representative legislature in Oregon, we'll pick Oregon because you're here, comes together? What do you want to mix and balance up just to make sure that this is a true democracy, right? Like you could have all of one thing or all of another, but it's better to have kind of a reflective mix. And just what are some things that matter to you? And there's no right answers here. Yes. Gender. See if I can actually write.
Do you want me to write it on the whiteboard?
Can you? That would be terrific. That actually would be great and would be so gender, income, what are some other things you just want to have a reflective mix of? It's all one thing. Age.
Ethnicity.
Ethnicities.
Rural versus urban.
Rural versus urban, pretty big deal here in Oregon.
Do you put ethnicity and race together?
Might as well, but they can be seen as different, but it's fine here for this exercise. Environmental sort of different segment on development or how we handle the environmental.
I think ease of voting.
Ease of voting. We'll get to that as like things we might want to reform. I think this is like interests. Like sometimes we talk about communities of interest, like transportation, views on transportation.
Sexual identity.
Sexual identity.
Marital status.
Marital status.
Education.
Education.
Renters.
Rent tenants versus homeowners and tenants. Renters.
Various abilities.
Various abilities as far as.
Like ADA kind of.
Yeah, reflective of people with disabilities and their interests being represented. So, the concerns about disabilities.
Career.
Right.
Career, different career.
Different careers, different professions, backgrounds.
Healthcare, Healthcare.
Healthcare. We can go on, and this is actually really good.
I missed one, somebody around here.
Yeah, and this is not a trick, but it was kind of a trick. Because what is the one interest that the Oregon legislature prioritizes over all others? It's the one thing that is guaranteed to be reflected in a representative.
Money, budget.
Money, well, I'll jump to the answer. It's geography. Where you live is going to be represented by one person in the House and one person in the Senate. So that feature is a choice in the electoral system to say that's the one that we are going to make sure is represented. For if one person votes in District 13 or whatever it is, they're still going to get a representative, even if 140,000 vote over in another district or something, right? It's not based on the number of votes. It's not even based on other things. And that is so the structure that we put in and we have prioritized is geography, where you live. Where you live is more important than what you think, really, in the fundamental sense of representation. And a lot of people end up with their one representative based on where they live. And you really don't like them very much, right? They don't feel well represented. Tough luck, right? Like vote, maybe you do on another level of election, hopefully. And then we do have a lot of levels of election in the United States. So one party could win all the seats, tends not to happen at a state level. It can happen at a local level. One gender could win all the seats for a lot of time. When Clarence Thomas was confirmed to the U.S. Supreme Court, there were 98 men in the Senate and 2 women. One racial group could win all seats. That's happened quite a lot with white Americans having that opportunity in a lot of places. One economic interest could win. And you do get the diversity of representation in the Oregon legislature and many of our legislatures because interests are not spread equally across. But it's not necessarily reflective. It's not necessarily reflective of you for what you end up with and what you're able to say. Your consent is kind of, how that is being measured. So, one last point. Districts are not just created in heaven. They're created by legislators usually, or they can have great political intent. So the definition of geography is subjective and can be greatly manipulated through the practice of gerrymandering. So we could do this exercise, and an exercise of time. I'm going to say, why might the U.S. need elect reform? I'd love to hear your thoughts, but I want to make sure I get through this presentation. So this is, I took this slide from Fairbrooke, where I worked for many years and still help out. This is just a list of some of the things on their mind. It's actually always fun to hear what is on your mind. Maybe you resonate with some of these, maybe less than others. Maybe actually, what I'll just for a shout out, is there one that's not here, if you just look over this, that just jumps out like, gosh, this really is another reason for me. There's no right answer, but if someone wanted to add to the list, of course, this is a pretty good list.
Electoral college.
Electoral college. National Popular Vote Plan. All right, there's a lot of things going on that can make our democracy better. So let's get into one particular approach. And I, as probably for many years, the leading advocate of ranked choice voting, it's been very fun to see that expand to many other people. I've always been careful to say, this is not the be-all, end-all solution. But I think it is a good, so I'm here as someone who believes it's a good idea. So, you can use single winner ranked choice voting, where you're electing one person for, of course, president. In a certain way for presidential primaries, with the added complexity that they're delegate elections, not just directly electing candidates there, but it has been used in presidential primaries. U.S. Senate, governor, mayor, when you're electing one seat to a legislature. Top lines, voters gain the option. In Australia, they require you to rank because they require you to vote. They just are into that kind of thing. But all the uses in the U.S., it's an option. You gain the option to rank. And when you do rank, and add a second or third choice, that can make your vote more likely to count. It promotes majority winners. It doesn't guarantee majority winners because we don't mandate rankings, so you can't mandate that someone's going to win with more than 50%, but you will always end up with someone in the final comparison of an instant runoff. That person has the majority compared to the other top person. And I believe it's a simple change with positive impacts for our democracy. So it's not used all over the country yet, but it is used pretty well. It's used for presidential elections in Maine, Alaska, and DC, for Congress there as well. And it is used for a lot of cities. The numbers kind of growing, changes. Like Utah, Republicans just stopped a bunch of cities that wanted to use ranked choice voting from doing so. But we're about 40 cities: New York City, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Santa Fe, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., New York City. So, but it's also used for military groups. So Lindsey Graham died, and there's going to be a quick replacement election, and they're going to have a runoff. And the reason why they can have a runoff just 2 weeks after the first round is all their overseas voters cast a ranked choice ballot, and they count that in the runoff for which whoever has made the runoff. So this is what the ballot looks like, and this one is from Salt Lake City. This is the basic ballot design that has been shown to reduce to basic voter education. Voters find this pretty darn intuitive, and you will see 99.7, 99.8% valid ballots. You see an incredibly high rate of voters doing it, and when they care about the electoral choices, when they care about more than one person, you will see them ranked. You will see 80, 90% in governor's races, sometimes more than that. So that's the ballot. The basic tally algorithm is you have one vote, but you are having a backup that might count, but only if your first choice can't win. So the algorithm is such that you add all the first choices. This is the first choice where it's conveniently 40, 30, 20, 10. And then you say, oh, no one has a majority, so you do not have a winner. So poor Darius is out. But Darius's voters are not out. Their ballots get to go to the second choice. Here's the new count. Andy stays ahead. And final round, when Carla goes out, Andy stays ahead. So you just have someone who led the first round just keeps ahead. But they've proven that they are the one who, when compared head-to-head, wins the instant runoff. And that's the way to think of it. It's just like when you get down to two, if Andy and Bert had been the only people running, and the voters that day had come to the polls, this is what you likely would have gotten: Andy winning 60 to 40. It's just like a accommodating choice and not resulting in quote-unquote spoilers. This is a real election from Maine. I wanted to use this example because it's relevant to our times. Another interesting thing with the U.S. Senate is Graham Plattner dropped down in Maine, and they are picking a new person, and several of the people who lost the governor's race are in the mix. So people are looking at this recent Maine Democratic primary, where, by the way, turnout was 100,000 more than they ever had before. It really engaged voters. And in this particular election, this guy named Nirav Shah led in first choices, but with only 27%. Now, in Oregon and in many places, that would be enough. You just win top of the heap. That's it. But in Maine, they have ranked choice voting, so they went through the algorithm, and you can see the count, last person out each time. In the final round, Hannah Pingree had vaulted ahead and won 56 to 44. Again, what that means, if only Hannah Pingree and Shaw had been on the ballot, she would have won 56-44. So this is like the fair outcome. And indeed, they've moved Maine from being a competitive governor's race to not, because she is seen as someone who has really unified the party. What was interesting is that Troy Jackson, Shenna Bellows, and Nirav Shah are all running now for Senate. They're kind of making their case, and people are looking over the rankings in all kinds of ways. Like, it turns out that Shenna Bellows beats everyone else head-to-head except for Pingree. So in a certain sense, maybe she's the most competitive person, but each one can kind of make their case. But you have a lot more information from a ranked choice voting election. So we'll just go through this quickly. Voters like ranked choice voting in practice. Not everyone, but large numbers do. So, and they generally find that ballot simple. They do need to get used to the outcomes looking different. That's, I think, the biggest thing. And we also need to make sure that we can get to a tallying process that's just as fast as others and all that's within reach. But anyway, a lot of encouraging things from ranked choice voting in practice. People might be interested in a big word voters method. You know, not just with women, but my wife runs Represent Women, and she has found that women have won more than half of all ranked choice voting in local elections in the last 10 years. And you have had cities like New York go from 13 to 31 seats being women in just one election. First use of it, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Salt Lake City. And you have a lot of promising things from a perspective of voting rights and how voters of color use the system. One thing that's interesting in like nonpartisan and primary races, kind of like the Hannah Pingree one, and actually that's a good example because a lot of the Shaw people ranked her second and third as well, is you'll get someone who like 75% plus had said, I like that person at least more than other people. So you get a sense of more kind of unifying dynamics. And voters, again, don't want to overstate this, but they generally find the campaigns so far positive, engaging, and less winning. I live in a ranked choice voting town, and you really do. You put up your own sign for someone, and you will get knocked on the door, and someone says, I know you're supporting someone else, but let me make a case for your second choice. And you have a conversation. You live that. There's a lot of arguments for ranked choice voting. I've kind of been touching on most of them, so I'm going to skip through those. And there's a lot of ways that you can use ranked choice voting. I'm happy to get into more of these in Q&A. I want to make sure we get to proportional RCD, but I will say that there are arguments that are different. It's a tool that can be used differently. So I don't, like some people say, oh, I don't really like how they're doing it in this way. It's like that, okay, you don't like that way of doing it. But you know, you might not like how voting happens in some way, but it doesn't mean we're against voting. So ranked choice voting just can be used for different ways. Arguments for partisan primaries, like can we get more unifying candidates? Like presidential field could be really wide open in 2028. Ranked choice voting could be a way to kind of crowdsource and identify someone that can bring people together. And in fact, it was used in 4 states in their presidential primaries in 2020. General elections, the classic thing for a lot of people was Ross Perot or Ralph Nader, these candidates who inject themselves as they should have the right to in a democracy to run for president, but they're outside the major parties, and their vote share can be far bigger than the margin, and they can change outcomes, right? And it happens, and that's because we don't have a ranked choice voting system, and that's one of the key arguments for it. One argument that would relate to Deschutes County in your current system is a lot of places that have passed have just said, short, faster, cheaper, better campaigns. Can I just get this done in one round? Can I do it when people vote more, and can we have short campaigns and not have a first round and a second round? Either not have a runoff afterwards or not have a lower turnout primary that winnows the field, or in your case, actually elects candidates. There's a model of ranked choice voting in Alaska that some of you might be familiar with. It's connects the Washington and California model. You're surrounded by these states, these all-candidate primaries where all candidates run together. But in those ones, only 2 people advance. And if you follow the California governor's race, there's a lot of controversy, like, oh my gosh, are the Democrats going to get someone in? And, you know, like all this like spoiler split vote. Seattle is now using ranked choice voting in that first round. So you would not have that kind of conversation in the top 2 system. Alaska has a model that I prefer, where you would advance more than 2 and just open up choice in November and use ranked choice voting to accommodate that. And I mentioned the overseas voters. And a kind of a cool one for me is just tons of organizations and colleges do it. We're up to more than 100 colleges and universities. It's very organic. It's a reflection of the fact that young people really like the power of ranked choice voting. Generally wins on local ballots. In fact, it's won the last 30 times. It's been on local ballots since 2018. Washington, D.C. Won 73%. New York, 73%. Portland, 58% with a proportional RCB for city council. And it's won statewide in Maine and Alaska. It had a rough 2024. And did get upheld in Alaska, but it lost in the all-candidate kind of top 4 model-ish, like Alaska. That was on the ballot in Nevada, Colorado, and Idaho, and they all lost. And then you find people in Oregon voting down ranked choice voting for in a more traditional way. And I wanted to kind of throw out some thoughts on why. You might know better than me, but just because it might come up. These are some things that I observed from afar was, that the legislature that put our city on the ballot worked really a grassroots campaign about it. It's sort of like the legislature just could have passed it. It has like a lot of laws. They didn't put automatic voter registration on the ballot, right? They just passed it. And that could have been the way they did it, but they punted it to the voters without necessarily a whole lot of people knowing what the problem they were trying to solve was. And when voters aren't sure of something, they tend to vote no. There's a presidential year, a lot of other things to think about. And it's one that we found, I think, why all those local wins is because you can actually talk to people. You can engage with people and you can have people hear about it. And when you go statewide, it's much harder to do that. And not a whole lot of that was done. I will say there's kind of a partisan element. Republicans in Oregon voted heavily against that. It's become much more severe in the last 3 or 4 years, much to my disappointment, because there's no rational reason for that. It's just, oh my gosh, American Household won in Alaska, I'm upset. And people kind of demonizing it. I think if we could get the count faster and the count normalized, a lot of those objections would go away, but they weren't. And in fact, your election administrators and officials were concerned about the impact on them, and I think the lack of clarity that, hey, this is something we can do statewide, created some concerns. And I am working toward trying to make this what I call a turnkey solution. So let's shift to proportional ranked choice voting. Actually, I'll pause for a second. Any burning questions about ranked choice voting before we go to proportional? Yes?
So I have one candidate that I want to win. Can I vote for that candidate for first, second, third, fourth, fifth choice?
You can, and it will count for your first choice, and all those other rankings are as if you left them blank.
Okay.
Because your ballot only leads to a first choice when that candidate cannot win anymore.
Okay.
Right? It's not a point system. Some people like follow sports, like Heisman Trophy. It's a point system. It's not a point system. So your ballot is all in for your first choice, and when your first choice is on the last, and they're out, then it goes to your second choice. And then at that point, if you had ranked out first, second, third, fourth, and fifth, you're saying, I'm going to walk out of this room and I don't care what happens to the rest. And some people do that. Yes?
Is it ever the case that you can limit, all your examples were a nice, neat 5. The young people I know in Portland were overwhelmed with the number of people to read all that as a citizen with a job. They came to me going like, what the heck? How can I be a citizen? It was overwhelming. So is there unusual, or is there a way that they're ever limited?
Yeah, and so this is the question about choice. In some ways, this is a kind of a proportional RCB question, but it's not. It's about just numbers of candidates. Minneapolis had this really simple ballot access law. California governor does, by the way. I don't know if you They had like 100 candidates this year. Like some states just kind of allow a lot of people to run. And Minneapolis had 35 candidates for mayor. Now, 30 of them got less than 5% of the vote or something like that, right? But they're on the ballot and they're kind of taking up attention and ballot space. So there's always interesting to think about what might go well with ranked choice voting. I think vote by mail goes well with ranked choice voting or getting your ballots at home because you have time to say, oh my gosh, who's running for school board? I'll do a little research into that. Another is just ballot access that doesn't shut people out who are credible candidates, but doesn't make it like just give $5 and be on the ballot or something like that, right? Something that you have to be a more serious candidate. Portland was in an interesting situation where they'd gone from this incredibly closed citywide system where only 4 city council members to having 12 3-member districts. No incumbents, I think, were running for any of those. They were all open. They were all up at the same time. And a lot of people were like, wow, this is great. And I'm going to jump and run in. They're going to have another cycle in Portland for half the city council this November. And I suspect they'll have a much kind of fewer candidates running and more serious ones. They'll have incumbents running. There'll be less sort of a sense that this is just wide open. I think sort of fundamentally, reasonable ballot access, and I would say Portland voters did negotiate the ballot quite well in practice. If you look at how they did their rankings, they actually, as a whole, used their rankings quite well and effectively, and had almost, very, very few mistakes. So it might have felt burdensome, but it was a burden of almost an excess of democracy, and sometimes we have the burden of not enough democracy. And I guess if I had a choice, I would go for excess. Yes?
I just wondered, will it increase the cost of running an election in terms of the time necessary to do all this reconfiguration?
The cost of the administrator or as a candidate?
The administrative cost of running an election, will it differ? Will it be more or less?
It depends on how ready that jurisdiction is with its equipment. Like in Deschutes, you have the same vendor they have in Multnomah County, which did Portland's election, is doing the county elections. So that's a big head start, right? You already having it, they're doing it in the same state. There is some work that we should always support. I always believe we should stand very strongly with election officials in general. They're under fire way too much in this country right now, and Oregon's a great example. They're often underfunded, and it just is trying to run democracy on the cheap. It's like, come on, we are the wealthiest country in the world. We can do better, and we don't. And I think there are some examples where we do better than others, but I think as a general matter, we should fund the elections more, and it should never get in the way of doing something that's better for democracy and for voters. And I think I didn't really lean into this case of how many more votes it counts. Let me go back quickly to this election. So this was the main governor primary, right? So in almost all primaries around the country, 40 states or whatever or more, this would be enough. And Shaw would have won with 27%. And we do get that. We do get people winning with that amount of votes. So he had 58,000 votes. Pingree in second had 50,000. And all those other votes were not part of the equation of the choice between them, right? So then you go to the final round, and Pingree's vote has more than doubled. She's gone from 50,000 to over 111,000. Shaw's votes has grown, but just not nearly as much, from 58 to 86,000. But still, that's a lot more voters who just, because they happen to vote for one of these trailing candidates, were not part of the decision, they now are. And that's like, what what else makes more votes count than that, right? You know, like, if we did mandatory voting, that would do it, right? You would just make everyone vote like they do in Australia. But this is a really big change in the votes counting, aside from like these dynamics of Pingree actually did a really good job of kind of reaching out and building consensus, and that's a good thing for democracy, but just in the sheer number of votes counted. I say all that in relation to that question, in that, yes, this can cost more money, but it also is a lot more democracy in a way that I feel helps get us to the consent issue. The other thing for candidates, we just did a study that I think will go live very soon with Expand Democracy in a group called Reinvent Albany. And it found that in comparing plurality to ranked choice voting, so not changing the number of elections, that there was at least a measurable reduction on the power of independent expenditures. And I think part of that is that, like if people have followed the last couple mayoral races in New York City, where a ton of money comes in New York City, and the candidates who have a lot more money in independent expenditures did less well in ranked choice voting than other candidates who had other things going for them. That was generally more about grassroots engagement and so on, in both 2021 and 25. So again, it isn't ironclad, but that is sort of an interesting thing for candidates. When you go from 2 elections to 1, that's a big difference for candidates. You know, having a campaign for a May primary here, oh, I didn't get 50%, now I got 6 more months of campaigning, bigger electorate, different dynamics. Like that's a lot of time and money, and much more than what most countries do. Most countries do not do that, and it just, I think, creates more. It's one of the, I think, nice arguments for ranked choice voting. Okay, we'll take 3 more, and then we'll get on to proportion. Yes.
When jurisdictions go to ranked choice voting, does voter turnout tend to go up or down?
It really depends. This question about turnout and impact on turnout. It depends on really what happens in the campaign. Ranked choice voting creates dynamics or creates incentives that are turnout inducing. And I think the main governor's race, and there were other ranked choice elections for Senate also, but I think it creates a dynamic where voters, candidates who are, they've gotten used to this in Maine, and they know it really is about getting out and getting touches on households, and you know, just making contact, making your case, and it allowed you, and this is one of the reasons why my wife has found it helps women candidates, is it really weakens the gatekeepers who say, oh, you shouldn't run yet. It's not your turn. And those people can actually bring people out to vote, and they can raise new issues. If you think in the general election sense of partisan, like a lot of people were not thrilled with some of the 2 choices they've had for major change for president the last few cycles, and yet the third party and independent is the spoiler in all of those issues that we know about, and it is a system that you imagine that they can run and they can make their case and they can maybe excite people, and then the other candidates have to compete and build a majority. That I think is generally going to increase turnout, but it doesn't always. It has a general pattern of doing that. Yes?
How many different types of ranked choice voting is there?
Well, I walked through some examples in this slide of just ways that it can be used. So there's sort of different applications, and some of those come with different rules. The ranked choice ballot is a whole rabbit hole of opportunities for different ways, algorithms. So there's the point system called the border count There's some people who like something called Condor state voting, where you compare every other candidate to one another. You can eliminate all candidates who don't finish in the top 2 at the same time and only have a second round of counting. The presidential primaries for Democrats, they run it down to where all candidates are over 15%, and then they stop. But here's what I would say, a common principle of the kind of ranked choice voting that I work for, we're talking about here. Actually, I'm about to get to it because it's about proportional also. But there's some commonality that I think we are about to get into as we get into that. Okay, we'll take 2 more questions. Here and then in the back.
Okay, when you gave your example with Pingree and Shaw, and it said round 1, round 2, those weren't rounds of voting, those were rounds of counting.
Correct. Oh yeah, because it's all based on the balance. It's all based on the ranked choice balance.
Round 2 was second choices, and round 3 was third choices now.
Let's get back here. So everyone has only 1 vote.
Right.
And so if the first person who went out was Angus King,
Right.
so he's out.
Right.
His 17,860 ballots are examined. They are moved to their second choice, or a computer tallying program does this, by the way, instantly, right? It's not slow. But, and then you have a new tally. Then the new person in last place was Shannon Bellows, and then her ballots move on, and so on. So if I voted for, say, Pingree or Shaw as the first choice, my ballot only counts for them the whole time. My second choices never get counted.
Okay.
But if I vote for Jackson, Bellows, or King, at least my second choice, if I voted for King, theoretically, I could have voted for Bellows second, and then for Jackson third, and then for Pingree fourth or something, right? And then my fourth choice would have counted.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
What are the arguments against or opposition to ranked choice voting?
Let's get into proportionality because I'm going to get into some of that. So it's a good question, but I think it's, election administration, and like the question about Portland, voters having more choices, maybe they're going to be confused. I mean, there's sort of like confusion and cost probably is the big thing. So let's get into proportional RCV. So it's the same ballot, and we'll explain that, but has a key difference because you're electing more than one person. And so for that, you have to do it only for legislatures, right? This is only a legislative method. If you Google single transferable vote, this is what that is generally called internationally. I kind of like it as like a voter representation system, and it's going to go back to those interests that we put up there. But it's used internationally to elect the parliaments of Ireland and Malta. It has the highest turnout in the world, by the way, in Malta. They use it in Senate in Australia and all local elections in Scotland. Our uses here in this country include Portland, Cambridge, Albany, California, where one really big, and then Minneapolis for just a couple down ballot offices like Hardcore. It's starting to be used more and more as a voting rights remedy, and we'll talk more about why that's the case, but a couple examples from California and New York just this year. So here's the things that's the same, all right? So voters rank the candidates the same way. The ballot you saw earlier is the same. It's also true, just like with instant runoff or ranked choice voting for one winner, everyone has one vote. Their rankings are sort of their backups. Your rankings maximize your chances for a meaningful vote. That's sort of a governing principle of what the system is designed to do. And it does this with both of the systems. So I'll explain that. And as many voters as mathematically possible will elect preferred candidates, and I'll explain that here. So here's what's different. You're electing more than one person, and here's the key underlying principle. The more seats that you're electing at a time, the greater the share of voters who are sure to elect someone, it keeps going up. And conversely, the percentage of votes necessary to win a given seat goes down. The majority does not win all. The majority owns the right to decide, but voters earn seats in proportion to their voting strength. So this is, in a sense, trying to say representative democracy should be representative. More interests are reflected among the winners. And I would say this is an interesting part of it, like what we were seeing here is a candidate will almost never be just one of those. There will be a little coalition that gathers voter support based on having something to say about across these dimensions and wins as like a little coalition of what they stand for. And as I mentioned, it can be a voting rights remedy in voting rights cases. So I wanted to talk about, I guess I thought I had another, sorry. So this is a slide about the Fair Representation Act. And I just want to talk briefly about this because this is like jumping away from local elections to Congress, but this is a very relevant conversation right now. So the Fair Representation Act, and maybe don't look at this slide for a second and just look at me, is the Fair Representation Act is a proposed statute, not constitutional amendment, statute in Congress, has the support of the Progressive Caucus, which is a caucus of more than 100 people, and it's got sort of an interesting array of sponsors, not a ton of sponsors, but it's having a beginning conversation. It is saying the current mandate that Congress established in 1967 to have geographic representation be the thing that we know we represent with single-member districts has just broken down. That system is no longer working, and there's a lot of obvious ways you can measure that. But the most obvious, perhaps, is this re-gerrymandering, districting. You're going to go through it. Everyone's going through it, almost after every election now. Liberal voters has been great in fighting gerrymandering, by the way, but it's baked into the current way the congressional districting is done without a new federal bill that changes that. And one federal bill could be to try to remove incentives or the means to do partisan gerrymandering for Congress and do that across all states. Fair Representation Act is saying, well, let's make it fundamentally fair with this proportional RCD system. This slide is essentially saying what the impact of that would be, but the functionality of it is it would create a system where every state that has at least 3 seats would have districts with 3, 4, or 5 seats, and then they use proportional RCD within them. And these are some of the things that would happen for having that. It would end the partisan gerrymandering wars. You would have, very reliably, both major parties winning out of every part of the state. And when the parties go into their caucuses, the whole state stays in the room, and the whole country stays in the room for Congress, and you don't have this red area, blue area, only one party speaks for that area. Legislators tend to have a lot more freedom to work across party lines. Critically, and we'll get into more about this, it upholds voting rights at this time of crisis, and women's representation, which is really stalled, still 28%, not much more in the last 4 years, is very likely to get sort of broken into opportunities. The two-party system wouldn't necessarily become like a European 6 parties or something like that, with some people who like proportional representation, and that's what they're after. The Fair Representation Act is much more likely to have the major parties be more reflective of their big tents, and independents and minor parties are fighting for an opportunity to win, and we'll explain the math of what that would take, but they have at least a fair shot, and they're never spoilers. These are some cons, and this relates to your con question, because some of these relate to ranked choice voting in general. So I'll just read these. Without turnkey solutions for administering RCD in place, which a lot of places don't have it, sadly, it will create costs and burdens for election officials while we transition toward that time, and it may delay be reporting their results. And I think at this point in time, people don't like delays in results. I think this is sort of on our community to get at those turnkey solutions. Without an increase in U.S. House seats, it would mean House members represent bigger areas. Oregon, there might be 2 3-seat districts or 1 6-seat district or something like a lot bigger, and that would be a big change. It is a statutory thing to change House seats, by the way, and we used to do it all the time. Without campaign finance reform, or competition in larger districts would create new demands on candidates for campaign money. And without really going to bigger districts, it would be hard for minor parties to reliably win, and some people really want that. And I would say this, fundamentally for change, without movement for change, this is whether that's local or whether that's for Congress, parties and incumbents are going to be fearful of change. Power concedes nothing without a demand, as has been said aptly. So let's go to proportional RCB in Deschutes. I thought, let's see, where's the, I must have jumped past this slide, sorry. I have slides that explain it. Where did it go? It's terrible. That's so weird. I'm puzzled. So I have slides that actually explain. That's why I'm sort of puzzled by the clarification on slide. I'm sorry, I'm just going to look and see what happened here, because I have some important slides that aren't showing up for some reason, and I have no idea why. Oh, it has some weird symbol. I'm sorry. Can you guys see that?
Yeah.
I'm just going to keep it at this size because it has some symbol that I don't know why it's doing that. Anyway, so back to what's different and the same about proportional RCD. It just skipped past all these slides. So here's the question. How large does a group need to be to earn representation, and how many voters elect winners? That's what this is showing. So the governing logic of actually any ranked choice system is you're trying to determine what's the fewest number of votes that only the winning number of candidates can obtain. Okay? So the way that most easily to think about that is when you're electing one person, what's the minimum number of votes that once you get there, you're like, yay, I've won. 50% plus 1. If you've got a majority, 50% plus 1, no one else can get 50% plus 1. So the same logic applies when you're electing 2 people. It's now 33.3%, or approximately, plus 1. And conversely, when you're electing one person, 50% are reliably going to elect someone. Now, if each seat takes 33.3, you're going to have 66% of voters will help elect someone with only 2 seats. With 3 seats, what it takes to win 1 goes down to 25% plus 1, because that's only the fewest number of votes that the winning number of candidates can get. And then 75% will elect winners. Your proposal that's being discussed here in Deschutes would have all 5 seats at large. Each seat would take 16.6% of the vote, and that would mean 83% of voters would elect winners. That's sort of the math of it. Here's how the count goes. So you first determine that threshold, which in some ways I just walked through, right? So for 5 seats, it's going to be 1/6 of the vote, just 1 vote more than 1/6. That's the math of what it takes to win. So in Deschutes County, in the presidential election in 2024, there were about 127,000 votes. If you assume, just for fun, 120,000 county commission votes, that would mean 20,000 votes would be the victory threshold. So that's the number that you would want to be working toward to win. So you add up first choices, just like ranked choice voting, single winner. Anyone who's over that threshold wins outright. It actually doesn't happen, but sometimes it doesn't happen for any candidates, and if it does, it only happens for, say, 1. It's like, it's hard to just, on win on first choices alone. So most candidates do reflect kind of this mini coalition concept, in a sense like they are speaking to people's interests across some of the dimensions that we wrote about there. Now here's an interesting difference. So in single winner ranked choice voting, the only votes that are counted or recounted are ones that go from the last place candidate. And that's part of the tally, but before you do that, you first see if someone has more votes than they need to win. And let's sort of use an example from the Deschutes thing. So we were talking about 120,000 votes for county commission. Let's say some candidate was just incredibly popular, and they got 61,000 first choices. Wow, that's great. They would win. If you just kept those votes there, that's 3 seats. That's the majority of votes that only elect one person. And that wouldn't be fair, because you're trying to be fair. So basically where this is done, you have, that creates surplus value, creates the votes beyond the threshold. In that dramatic case, it would be 40,000 votes would need to be reallocated, and it would be basically 1/3 of each ballot would count for the winner, and 2/3 of each ballot would go to their second choice. And so you would end up with a value staying with the winner, that's 20,000, but those other 40,000 votes across all voters would be, all those voters for that candidate would go to their second choice. And I'll give you an example of that in just a moment. So then you do that, okay, you're finished with all of the surplus transfers, then you go to the last place candidate, they're out, and you count their ballots for their next choice. And then you repeat this process and all seats are filled. So with the Deschutes in that example, assuming people ranked the candidates, you would end up with 5 candidates, each getting about 20,000 votes, and they would have collectively 100,000 votes. And you would essentially be representing a lot of people in Deschutes with someone who they support. So here's an example, I hope you can still see this, of the tally, and this is another fair vote slide, and they kind of tried to keep it short. But, so you have a surplus vote here, right? So you have the candidate on the left who has 35%, so they only needed 25% to win, so there's surplus value, so that gets transferred first, right? So that's the next count. That brings that person down to 25%. That moved the person in orange, who must have been sort of aligned with that person on some interest. That puts them at 25%. So now you've got 2 winners, but one candidate is just short at 23%. And then that's when you move this candidate to 12%. They are taken out of the field. And then that's going to be our next slide. And their ballots go to the next choice and put this person over. So then you end up with 3 people all having at least 25%. And that's sort of the math of it. I think it's important to think about what that means for just the changes it makes for candidates. Because all these slides got skipped, you heard about it for the Fair Representation Act without much context. But let's talk briefly about Cambridge, Massachusetts. They've used this for a long time. Actually, Cambridge is the 4th largest city in Massachusetts, pretty diverse. It's where Harvard and MIT are, but it also has blue-collar community and other people there. They've had the system for a long time. They have 9 seats being elected. So someone was asking about candidates in Portland. They'll have a ballot with 25, 30 choices. Most people will elect one of their high-ranked people. And so if you can say, oh, I really like Jill, or I really like so-and-so, good chance that informed vote by who you really like will actually be the one that is most likely to count. 95% of voters see one of their top 3 candidates win. So just think about what that means for representation, right? That means very few people in Cambridge feel unrepresented by the city council. They might not like what it's doing, but they have someone there who is, they rank pretty highly. 94% choose to use their rankings. Neighborhood representation, interesting, they don't have districts, but the geography of the city is very well represented because that's a factor for voters, but not a requirement, right? Not like the current system where that's the requirement, it's just a key factor. For race, it's interesting, Black candidates have actually won continuously. Since the 1950s, they have elections every 2 years. And there's never been a time when a Black candidate has not won. It's not a quota or anything, it's just there's strong Black candidates and it takes 10% of the vote to win. City's only about 10% Black. And they don't just rely on African American votes, but it is an important factor. And it's exceptionally well governed. It consistently has the highest municipal bond rating of AAA. It's liberal, but it gets the job done from a governance perspective. So I wanted to mention a little bit about voting rights, because how many of you have heard about the Calais decision that struck down the Voting Rights Act as we know it today? It's interesting. More of you should hear about this, or maybe need someone to come in and talk about that one, because this is a really dramatic Supreme Court ruling. Some people on the election law community would say it's the worst decision the Supreme Court has done since Dred Scott. So it's a really bad decision from a lot of people's perspective, but it has struck down the Voting Rights Act, and it will have a dramatic impact on African American representation in the South and Congress immediately. We've had redrawing of districts in Tennessee, Louisiana, which other state did it quickly. There's others about to do it. And there will probably be a reduction of about 15 African American representatives collectively within a couple of years. And you had Florida doing districts that are different. And it's much, much harder to do the traditional remedy to where you have to prove racially polarized voting, and the fact that voters of color are trying to come and elect candidates of choice and they're being denied by a winner-take-all election system. Under those conditions, you have to redraw districts in a different way. That's now basically impossible to do with districts really hard. And so it's creating a whole conversation about the proportional systems and proportional RCV in particular. So I would say the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which is different than the NAACP separately, is probably the most influential legal group doing work on voting rights. And Janae Nelson said this just a couple weeks ago: we must begin socializing the use of alternative voting systems like ranked choice, and cumulative voting, which is another system, which with necessary investments in turnout give voters more options to exercise their power to elect their representatives. Similar quote from Spencer Overton, who's leading a really fascinating project for the George Washington Multiracial Democracy Project. So we're going to get a lot more conversation about this as a voting rights remedy, given that traditional remedies are now much harder. So here we have our introduction to the Fair Representation Act. So I did describe it briefly, so we won't go again, but basically those are the things that would be established by this new bill, which I'm a fan of. So we talked about the pros, we talked about the cons. So we're now back to Deschutes. Okay, so I want to, as a disclaimer, there's a campaign for this. There's people who are taking positions on this. I'm not from Deschutes County. My sister is, but this is not something I'm coming here to say you should do this or you shouldn't do this. I am someone who does believe this system of voting, as a general matter, is a good system of voting. But every application needs to be examined and every choice is within it. But here's my understanding of it. So that all 5 county commission seats would be elected at the same time every 4 years in presidential elections, starting in November 2028 if it passed this year. If it passes in 2028 instead, and it's not on the ballot this year, then it would be 2032 that change would kick in. What that does is an interesting thing. When you think about the mass of how many voters in a 5-candidate proportional RCV election elect someone, right? Remember, it's about 83% of voters. And the presidential turnout is the highest. and the most representative. So basically, this is the maximum representativeness you could ever have with a member county commission. And right now, you vote 4 times for up to 4 times for the county commission, right? Primaries and general elections, in midterms and general elections. And this would go to just once. So you have this focused ability, which is sort of what most countries do. If you follow countries around the world, you just have an election every 3 or 4 years, and that's the big deal, and you focus on it, and you get representation, and that's what happens. But that's a change, and we'll talk a little bit more about the implications of that. In fact, we'll talk about that immediately, it turns out. So, non-staggered elections, so I've had some conversations with people, and this is one that's come up, and again, this is a choice that those backing this particular ballot measure have made, my understanding for this representativeness question. So right now, you have 2 seats up, well actually you have 4 seats up this year, right? So you almost could have a complete turnover.
No, we increased the number of commissioners this year.
Right.
That's the change.
And it happened to work out with 4 or up, but that's not always, it's usually 3 and 2. So that does mean that, if you, the most they could ever leave at a time would be 3 or 2, usually. And theoretically, 5 people could go out, right? In practice, that's not very likely, I think. But, it's a factor, because what would have to happen is all incumbents retire at the same time. Oregon doesn't even allow counties to have term limits, so you're not going to have term limits. It's going to be, they all get tired at the same time with it. And incumbents, for whatever reason, they often don't get tired of it. And here's an interesting part of ranked choice voting I want to briefly explain. It's an interesting one to mull. And you have a countywide, a pretty divided county, right? It's been Trump won it in 2016, Harris won in 2024. But depending on the midterm vibe, it could go one way or the other. Most incumbents do well with proportional ranked choice voting elections when you look around the world. When you think about it, they've won because they built that coalition, right? And if they do pretty well, and they don't lose the support of people who rank them highly, and they sometimes lose, but if they do a good job, according to the people that elected them, they are very likely to stay there. If you get that kind of national swing, right, like a 10% national swing, in a pretty divided county like yours, that could mean one side wins one time, and then the other side wins the next time, and they win everything. Right. Now you have staggered elections, so that means they don't take all 5 seats. But they wouldn't be able to, if you had that swing in a presidential year, a 10% difference from 1 year with this and then 4 years later. When you think about that, that only affects at most 1 seat, right? Because most voters aren't that swing voter, right? So it just actually is a more stable system overall, even while it is being a representative one. It does accommodate change. I hear you're voting on this district proposal, and you think about all the population changes that can happen across the decade in a county like Deschutes. Districts don't accommodate that well. This system fluidly does, and you would have changes associated with that. But it wouldn't be as dramatic as one might think. Okay, I just want to talk about turnout, because it's an interesting factor for me when I think about representative government. Primary elections are a big deal in the United States for determining representation. It just isn't in our system, because very few general elections are competitive. If you follow elections for Congress, we're down to 25 competitive seats in a even year, and maybe when one year has an advantage, one party has an advantage, that 25 changes and who's vulnerable, but most people are not vulnerable, so that means the primary determines everything. Your system that you have right now in Deschutes elevates the primary electorate quite a lot. You've had 2 people win their seats outright, and they will not go to the November ballot. They're done. The turnout in November 2024 was more than 50% higher than the primaries in 24 and 26. With no aspersions of the people in this room, nearly half of Oregon primary voters are 65 years old, even though barely being a quarter of registered voters. And I'm going to show that what that means on the next slide. But that's not reflective, right, of the registered voters and what you get in the November election. You also have closed primaries for your state and federal races, and that's going to drive some people out to vote who are registered Democrats or Republicans in the primary, but if you're unaffiliated, you can't vote in those, and then you just might vote on the ballot measure against transportation funding or whatever you might do, and vote on the local races, but a lot fewer unaffiliated people do that. You have automatic voter registration as well, right, which is a good thing. I helped get that going as an idea, and I'm really proud of it. It also has to register people automatically as unaffiliated. So all these young people are being registered unaffiliated, and they can't vote in your primaries, right? So here's what your primary electorate looks at right now. Can you see that slide? Oops. It's so if you look at the registered voters, this is just age, but you can really do this by other measures as well. So on the right side is voters over 65. They are about 25% of registered voters, and you can see that they were 44, 44, and 47% of the ballots cast in our primaries. Voters under 35 are about the same. They're actually a little greater percentage of the registered voters, and their turnout was 10%, 11%, and 10%. And we talk about like democracy and bringing people in and representing the future and having everyone be part of it. That's something to think about, right? So there's different approaches to that. One, if you just did ranked voting in single winner in November, that also would bring those voters in and make them a part of the choice. But I think it's, it's just a factor that I wanted to elevate. So, again, I like proportional ranked voting, no questioning. Your choice about it is obviously yours, and your factors matter, and the way it's been discussed or presented is something for you to think about. But here's just things I wanted to sort of end with. So I do believe, and I'll be frank, I think we should pass the Fair Representation Act for Congress. I think there's a lot of good reasons that were somewhat erratically presented here, I'm afraid. But our nation would also, as a general matter, if we think about consent of the governed and representativeness, would be better if we could move to proportional RCD or similar systems that are more inclusive than winner take all, and more inclusive of systems that make 90% of elections not competitive, and the electoral college system, which we didn't talk about the national popular vote, but that makes every vote equal across the country. We should get that done too. But this is, in some ways, that approach to legislative elections. Let's make every voter in every election cast a meaningful vote. For those who care about voting rights, and those who care about whether we are going to be a successful multiracial democracy, winner take all has always been an awkward fit with that goal. And it happened because of being able to engineer districts to create opportunities for racial minorities where they otherwise wouldn't naturally be able to. Well, now we're back to, now they're not only being not having natural opportunities, they're having unnatural barriers because about half of African Americans in this country live in southern states run by Republicans who are gerrymandering the heck out for their party with almost no African American support. And so we are going to basically back to Jim Crow democracy, not by access to the ballot, but at least in congressional elections, because of winner take all and our acceptance of winner take all. So that's a big conversation for us. We are seeing proportional diversity being used for more voting rights cases, and it's always generally done in places that are sort of not very tolerant toward racial minorities in the first place, which is why they lose voting rights cases. And if we could see, I believe, more voluntary acceptance of a fair system where everyone gets their fair share of the pie, that I think sets a precedent that could be a positive one for everywhere else. And winning a majority of seats is good, but winning a majority should win the right to decide, but that doesn't mean you need to win everything. And I think if we can sort of believe that democracy might be actually healthier if we bring different perspectives in, rural, across these dimensions. There are really a great list, by the way, of these dimensions that I think can be helpful. And my belief still, even with the ups and downs of the advocacy for this, I believe we can get to a point, which Australia and Ireland have done, where essentially voting is ranking at this point in those places. And I'm hoping that we can eventually get there too. So, we took out some questions earlier, and I'm going to now open it up to more. So, yes.
Have you looked at or considered or studied open primaries?
Yes, open primaries can come in different flavors. I'll briefly describe the main ones. So, like Washington, D.C. just passed semi-open primaries. So they went from ones where unaffiliated voters could not vote in primaries to unaffiliated voters now in their upcoming elections can choose a primary to vote in, and then they vote within that primary without needing to change their registration. Maine just did that, led through the legislature. New Mexico just did that through the legislature. And you see a number of states doing that. You're seeing some states moving the other direction and trying to close some primaries. But I think with so many more people being unaffiliated, I think in Oregon's a great example. You've got a lot of unaffiliated voters, and I think some have got to change, and that's the easiest one. The more dramatic one is these idea of all candidate primaries, where you no longer have a Democratic primary, a Republican primary, and so on, and you have all candidates running together, and then you have some number of them advance. In California and Washington, it's 2. Alaska, it's 4. I see the merit of that. I also see the merit of keeping separate primaries and having semi-open primaries. I don't see much merit in closed primaries. I know that some parties are like, oh, they're just like trying to, undercut what we want to do. I think what it does, like the main Democrats attracted 3 out of 4 unaffiliated voters voted in their primary, and now those candidates feel more connected to their candidates. I think that's good for the party, right? Parties are able to compete. The Deschutes County Democrats, I was there last week, they are very good at competing within a nonpartisan system, right? Like parties can get the job done when they have a connection to voters. And I think that allowing mostly young people and other people who are unaffiliated to participate for opportunity to participate in the contest is a good thing. Yes?
When a question is asked, would you please repeat it?
Oh, yes, sorry.
Thank you.
So that was a question about primaries, and that's such a good point. Sorry about that.
Thanks.
Yes?
Is there any sense of how ranked choice voting is affecting the obscene amount of money that gets tossed around in elections?
Yeah, questions about how much money is spent in elections, which is obscene, as you say, and this year is just going beyond obscenity. Right? It's just a whole nother level. I'll just bring back Maine again. There's talk of that race for the Senate being maybe a $300 million race in a state that has 1.2 million people. And a lot of the states are pretty poor too. It's like, come on, people. So there's so few races that matter. You know, certain primaries, broken seats, certain swing states, the money just kind of goes there. That's a much bigger question than can be answered with any single reform, but I think it's one we need to tackle as a country. I will say that proportional ranked choice voting or proportional systems in general, because they elevate the voters' first and second choices, the ones they know the best. So you may think, oh my gosh, a big ballot, you need to know about everyone. It is helpful to know about everyone, but actually your first or second choice is pretty reliably going to count. Those are the ones that are the least expensive, in a sense, to earn. And the voters generally find those people through means that aren't just billboard ads or TV ads and so on. A lot of the money is spent on certain categories of voters and not the voters who actually know their mind. So it's a huge question. I'd like your voter guide, by the way, Dave, Oregon with voter guides. We don't have one in Maryland. I was just hearing today you don't get voter guides in some of your midterms in all counties and stuff. And you know, like again, invest in democracy would be better, and I hope we can do that. I think that's actually kind of a good thing for money in politics. There's an effort that American Promise is leading to change the Constitution that 25 states have actually passed, most recently in that radical bastion of Idaho. And so to call for doing Citizens United and ways to regulate campaign money. So big deal and no single change can fix it.
It seems like in looking at some of the other countries, I get some questions about endorsements and about putting some kind of like 3 words under people's names and slates, and how do you, what guardrails should there be and people working together or not working together and just creating chaos? Or as in Portland, I talked to one person who said, I didn't realize I really only got one vote out of all the 12 people, basically. But then hearing that 40% of the things that were brought up, I guess because they have 6 and 6, made it, they needed some tiebreaker or something, so that some of the issues. Anyway, I'm throwing all those questions.
Yeah, so this is the question, well, first part of it, if I interpreted it right, was, at least I'm going to interpret it this way, which is fun, which is that nonpartisan ballots and primary ballots could be modified, and there was a poll done on New York City voters when the majority thought this was a good idea, so that's good, could show endorsements right on the ballot beyond the party, but just to institutions in that jurisdiction that have sort of qualified as endorsing organization. So it kind of broadens the power of endorsement to more organizations and individuals. Like people say, gosh, I really want to know what so-and-so thinks. A candidate could choose 2 or 3 of those and say, I'm endorsed by these things, and that would be a choice. They can only list ones that are true, and they don't have to list ones they don't like. But it would be a way to tell voters more, and I think it actually is kind of a campaign finance reform too. It's sort of a way to clarify balance. So that's one way that association can be used in a way that I think would be positive, and could be a good complement to something like proportional RCD. I think you were also getting into Portland and its government, and it's went from a 4-member city council to 12, all new people. They've had this, they're forming committees, like they're doing a lot of things for the first time and governing at the same time. And it's very democratic in the sense that almost everyone in Portland elected someone. It's sort of like it's small detail, right? Right, so it's one where a lot of change is happening, not all the change is simple. I think in general, Portland actually is on a good track. We'll see how this midterm, this next elections go for 60s, and it's sort of adapting to the system and people learning to work for it and creating a government that delivers for the people. That's fundamentally what we have to do. Yes?
Oh, is that me?
Yes.
Okay. I have to confess, I am an RCV proponent.
That's an okay thing.
Okay. I have helped get it into certain organizations. And I will tell you that I've encountered a lot of resistance from conservatives, lots of conspiracy theories about it. I think it's, and unfortunately we lost the last time we put RCV on the ballot. For me, it's critically important that the next RCV that goes on the ballot, we win.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, there's a lot of ways to do it. I have great concerns about the all 5 at once, because people are going to look at it and say, well, only 16% voted for this person, and we're talking about turning everything over every 4 years. And while we have legislative bodies, we have, so like in our legislature, the House turns over every 2 years. Everybody's up. And the Senate is every 4 years. And they do the off. So my concern about what we're looking at right now is it's not going to pass. And it's going to make it that much harder for us to get another RCV in a future election. And I'm wondering, we've lost. I want to win the next time. What are you seeing? Because, I love the Alaska model. I think it's awesome. And I am the only officer in the Democratic Party statewide that voted for open primaries. But, it's, these reforms are really important. I want to see them get through. But we need to, right now, get a majority of people, 50% plus 1, to support the reform. And we got these conspiracy theories going off, and we've got maybe too many changes at once. What's the best strategy for getting our CV in? Because even in
Repeat your question.
even in Oregon, even in Portland, you're only talking about 3 people. So they all had to get 25% of the vote, right? Because they were voting by precinct. When we say, hi, we're going to do this whole thing, and you don't get another shot at it for 4 years, I'm really nervous about trying to sell that. I don't want to see this go on the ballot, because I think we'd have a better shot if it was 3 and 2. But
here's what I'm saying.
We're trying to get these
really about,
passed.
as a renters voting fan, but also a concerned advocate and concerned about viability and the case for establishing a record that this wins and building from there versus models that might lose. So I'll answer this one as I'm not speaking for the campaign, and there is a campaign, and I don't know if there's anyone in the campaign in the room who could say, hey, we're doing an event coming up, we'll end, that's right, we'll do that. But here's what I would say, is that I think it's a very valuable conversation in the stage it's in right now, right? It's collecting signatures, we're talking about it, there's more opportunities to talk about it from local school, really make the local case. I think there's always trade-offs in any election system. I will say proportional ranked choice voting speaks in some ways to the moment, broadly, more powerfully than single winner ranked voting, which I am a huge fan of single winner ranked voting. I wish Oregon had passed it, but I think in some ways, the very straightforward arguments for what it would have done were kind of legislative. Like, I wish the legislature had just passed it, right? The way they did automatic voter registration. There are other things that affected voting. It doesn't always have to go to the voters. Sometimes it was just kind of like in some ways, a legislative fix. Like, our primaries can be won with 29%. We need a system that creates more unifying candidates, and we get spoilers sometimes, but not often, and this is the system to deal with that. But I think that the proportional system creates a conversation about what winner-take-all means in this country right now, and the dangers of winner-take-all. I'm not saying it's dangerous in Deschutes County right now, though I'm not a big fan of what I've heard of the district proposal. That sounds like a machination, and you can see your own forms of this.
I'm with you on that.
Yeah, but I'm not informed enough to know that this can't win, and I think the concerns about say turnover, I think can be logically addressed, maybe not emotionally addressed or something, right? Like, it could happen, it just probably won't. But I think actually the fact you can have a conversation about single member districts creates a conversation about what representation should be, kind of along the lines of what we did earlier. Does geography matter most? Do these other things matter most? Do we want to have one side win everything? Some people like that, right? But do we want to have kind of a more representative government? And I think that the Fair Representation Act in Congress, which may seem like pie in the sky to actually impose this model federally, it may actually be the only really reliable way to deal with the gerrymandering crisis and the voting rights crisis. It may be actually the only way to do it. And Congress doesn't do national ballot measures. They just pass things, right? And there's a lot of talk of a bold Congress doing something about the Supreme Court and about some other changes. And I think this is of a kind with that. So that's an example of how that conversation could be a very national one. I'm not saying it's going to pass in 2029, but it could. And I think that the conversation about it kind of gets mirrored in some of these local settings. But again, this is a conversation for you all to sort out. Yes?
You didn't get to go into this yet, but you said there's a points system version of proportional ranked choice voting? There's a point system. Probably there is for proportional. I don't know what it is. There is one, there's people back some esoteric systems and they come up with proportional models. There's no point system that I know that's used in government elections. It is a conversation people have for single winner. To have a point system, and in the Heisman Trophy, candidates are identified for best football player, and the voters rank them, and the first choice gets 5 points, the second choice gets 3, and the third choice gets 1. That's kind of a sort, and then you just add up all the points. And that can work if everyone's really honest and not strategic. It breaks down if voters get strategic. Anyway, I'm just saying that that's not part of the proportional RCD conversation. What would the cons be to that? I may not understand it clearly, but if you're accumulating likes, like if it's just a bunch of likes, not likes, right? If you're accumulating likes, wouldn't that be looking for someone who is building goodwill with the most amount of people would then rise to the top?
Yeah, so
here's what I say, this is about this point system model, and might that actually identify a candidate who was more consensus builder. I think if we saw that Hannah Pingree example from Maine and kind of walked through how she really was the consensus candidate, that generally is identified well with the classic instant runoff model. The thing that ranked choice voting in that model does is your second choice never hurts your first choice. So you have every incentive to express it, because it might help be your last choice, right? So when you're looking at voter incentives to use the system, if your second choice might hurt your first choice, like, ooh, wait a second, I might really like Amy, but I'm not sure if I want to.
Right.
I like this other person too as a second choice, but I'm not sure if I want to have that person beat her, and if I give her points, that might happen, right? It's that kind of thing. So people start not using the system honestly. So actually, this is for interesting history of these things. In the 1790s, during the French Revolution, there was a lot of conversation about all this. So the kind of Condorcet, who had the idea of the Condorcet model, and then this guy Borda came up with the Borda count point system, and he said, this is a system for honest men. And if they're not honest, don't use it. and by honest, he meant people who are disinterested in sort of, engineering out something to help their son. And hey, a little self-interest is just going to be part of our Yes?
Can you address the impact of social media and the education scape that we face, especially with young people, and how that affects the different models? And I do suggest that there could be a thing at the DMV that somebody else besides the voters must influence how you can choose when you get your ID. If you want to be asked, do you want to be Republican, not like there's an educational moment there that doesn't have anything to do with how we vote. But I'm really concerned about the lack of the democratization of the internet has been a full part of democracy that we're talking about. So how does that impact the ability to know in these algorithmic voting systems?
Well, here's what I would say. You put a finger on something, so about social media, impact of social media on our democracy, the health of our democracy, some adjacent ideas about how we can educate young voters about voter registration.
Facts, yeah. How does it affect?
Well, all these tools, these technologies, and AI is the next one coming, right? Have both promise and danger and peril. And often the money seems to be more governed by sort of elevating the peril. So it's a tool that can be used for good. I think like we saw Twitter help Egyptians organize against their dictator during the Arab Spring or something like there can be times when it kind of helps them organize, and yet it can just increase toxicity and misinformation in just dramatic ways, and we're seeing that across social media uses and the fracturing of our media landscape and people not trusting traditional sources, and there's a lot of deep challenges that affect the health of our democracy and the commonality of our information and belief in it. And so there's no shortage of things to think about. Expand democracy, we're trying to kind of look for ideas there and lift them up. In context of this conversation, I would say that one thing I like about ranked choice voting, and again, I do not want to say this is just the answer to everything, but it is a system that creates incentives for candidates to engage with voters in different ways, and for voters to engage with candidates in different ways. like New Mexico, when they're first rolling this out in Santa Fe, is an open seat race for mayor. There are 5 candidates, and they said the best attended debates throughout the campaign they'd ever had. And they were talking to people like, what's going on here? And it's like, well, they're interested in the election. But a lot of people would come out and say, well, I already made my choices for my first and second choice. I just was really trying to figure out who my third choice is. You know, like, so you start listening to people in more ways. So it's creating an incentive to engage. A piece of the puzzle that we all need to figure out. It's like, it's a big puzzle that we're all looking for. So I don't know how to...
We're going to go longer. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Rob.
And can I say thank you, Legal Room voters? You guys are great. So thank you.
He did talk a little bit about the district mapping. For those of you who are still following it, it will be on the agenda at the County Commissioners meeting at 9 o'clock this Wednesday. So hope to see you all there. And we could probably continue this conversation for hours, but the test will be on the table, and then when you're finished, you can just mail it back.
Carol, can I? So I did.
Is this so? Yeah, so I did mention for those who are in the room who might be interested in hearing from the local campaign, does anyone from that campaign just want to talk about an event that's coming up or two, or verified information? Yeah. Yeah. So we have to get out of here. So it's just an event. So.
Tony Hallett, one of the chief commissioners.
Just stand up and talk louder.
Norman Hollinger. Tony Hallett, one of the chief petitioners. We'll be outside. We'll be outside to respect your library time. But find me, find Tajane or Jim in orange, Kim in blue. We'll be outside. Thank you.